Namaskar, I'm Ashok Vyas. And it is always a delight to talk to someone who is passionate about what he's doing. And when you hear Professor Salvatore Babones, you feel energized by sheer flow of information backed with his insight to add the dots which sometimes are not properly perceived by many of us. And what we will be talking about relates to the important paper which he has written, and that is the weaponization of caste in America. And what it is, we'll learn from him. Professor Saab, welcome. Namaste.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, before we talk about caste and how you have used the term weaponization of caste in America, let me request you to share your impressions of having been to Bangkok for World Hindu Congress. How was it? What new thing you learned there?
The World Hindu Congress was really a new sort of experience for me as a non-Hindu. I was one of the very few non-Hindus there, obviously, and it was an opportunity to meet especially a lot of religious people. Ordinarily, I meet only lay people of all religions. I don't meet monks or dedicated religious devotees very often. And at the World Hindu Congress, of course, it was perfectly ordinary to have monks walking around, interacting with you. And so sitting down and having several lunches and dinners with people who devote their lives every day to worship really was an eye-opening experience. It humanizes people. For someone like me who's, look, frankly, completely atheistic, to have these sorts of conversations is relatively rare. And I think I really learned a lot from it.
Yeah. So now, as I as a you describe yourself as an atheist, which I will not take much of your and my time on that, but I'm just reminded of what Swami Vivekananda said about this, and he said that new religion says atheist is the one who doesn't believe in himself. So that's why you can't be an atheist from Swami Vivekananda's definition. Well, you believe in what you are doing, and there's sincerity of purpose there too. Yeah.
Well, with all respect to Vivekananda, I don't call myself an atheist in the sense of having a positive identity as a sort of atheist believer in atheism. Instead, I describe myself as atheistic, meaning that I don't have any belief in a divinity. People can feel how they want about that. That's simply the person I am.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep the rest of conversation on this topic for some other day. But the reason I also wanted to bring it up is when you were in the presence of n number of Hindus who are openly declared Hindus because it is World Hindu Congress, and you were one of the few who were non-Hindus who were participating there. So, was there anything that gave you the feeling that the way these people practice, there is a sense of discrimination against a particular group, or the feeling or the impression that you had in general as an outsider?
There was certainly no sense of exclusivity, and in fact, there was an atmosphere of inclusivity. But that's only to be expected because the groups that were very present there. So the conference, of course, is organized by the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the World Hindu Council. It was the two main sectarian sponsors who were there were the Hare Krishnas and the Chinmayanda Mission. And all three of those organizations have spent more than 100 years seeking to break down caste barriers within the Hindu faith. And so that these particular groups would have a very inclusive tone is not at all surprising. Now, I'm not an expert on the Hindu faith. I don't know if there are still today Hindu groups that are exclusive, I really wouldn't know if that were true or not. What I can say is that all of the major mainline Hindu denominations with which I'm familiar, and certainly everyone who was present at the World Hindu Congress, are people who are what we would say in the Western world ecumenical in their approach to the Hindu faith. And beyond that, are broadly accepting of people of other faith, or in my case, of no faith.
Mhm. So, Professor Babones, principally speaking, when we talked about Swami Vivekananda, he came with Vedantic philosophy to Western world, which is talking about a sense of oneness and non-duality. Inclusivity is not just an integral part of it, principally speaking, and how it is practiced. Of course, there are multiple variations. So this was one of the few occasions where Hindus got consciously together to talk about issues other than devotion. Because generally, like you have heard about Kumbh or other gatherings where it is just pure flow of devotion. So the sense of being aware of what is happening in the world and what is your role as a community, etc. I think they had certain lectures on those issues also. Now, let me come to America and your. I read your paper, though it's not very exhaustive, yet it is in depth and it is to the point. And the way you have seen a big picture of what is the potential intent with which what is happening, and you also talk about how Sikhs, Muslims, and Dalits coming together, etc. But before getting into the details, how do you see caste in the context of the community in America? Is there any relevance even to bring that up, considering the number of people whom you may bring in the under the umbrella of being Dalits in America?
I was actually at the World Hindu Congress to speak about caste in America, and people may be interested to hear that, as you suggested, the World Hindu Congress was not primarily about religious issues; it was about Hindus in the world. And so, not only my presentation, but all the presentations I heard were about Hindus living in the larger world, and very often in the Western world, because most of the participants seem to be from the U.S., UK, or the broader diaspora. In the United States, Hindus are a relatively small group, something like 1 to 1.5% of the US population. Yet the issue of caste based discrimination has become nationally prominent. And I think it's telling that that's so because it's unlikely that it's become nationally prominent because it's actually an important social issue. This is actually a very minor issue. We have very few alleged incidents of caste-based discrimination. We have every major Hindu organization disclaiming or opposing caste-based discrimination in the United States. So it seems to be a non-problem. Yet for a non-problem, there's an enormous amount of political energy being directed towards supposedly preventing or prohibiting discrimination based on caste. But in my paper, I make an argument based on all of my own observations that this doesn't seem to be actually intended to prohibit or prevent caste-based discrimination. The politicization of caste seems to be mainly focused on associating caste with the Hindu faith in the broader American mind.
So, what your expression is, you have said this is being raised, looks like to stigmatize Hindu faith. And there is another reference that this is also to maybe give a bad name to Hindu religious institutions in America. Um, you have referred to one T. Sundar Rajan, founder of Equality Lab, and how that narrative of anti-Dalit discriminating discrimination seems to be guiding all these political actions. And you also talk at length about the California 2022 SB
Right.
403 bill. So give our viewers a sense of what Equality Lab is and how it becomes the source of reference to come up
Okay.
with something. Yeah.
I said earlier that Hindus represent 1 to 1.5% of the U.S. population. That's somewhere on the order of 4.5 or 5 million people. Within that group, self-described Dalits constitute a tiny minority within a minority. So probably, according to our best data, around 20 to 25,000 people in the United States identify as Dalit. Now, the reason that number is so small is because Dalits do face serious disadvantage in India. They are a relatively poorer, relatively less educated group in India that, of course, did face serious historical discrimination. As a result, there are relatively few Dalits who have the proper degrees and resources to be able to move to the United States. That said, the small number of Dalits who do make it from India to the United States represent a highly privileged group. They seem to be concentrated in Silicon Valley, in technology, and in medicine. And they do not seem to have any of the disadvantage that Dalits face in India. Now, that hasn't stopped Tanmosi Sundararajan, who is the founder of this organization called Equality Labs. She is a self-described Dalit American, American born, as I understand it, to parents who were, I believe, medical doctors who came from India in an earlier generation. Her organization seems to be a personal vehicle. It's not clear that anyone else is, well, no one else seems to be publicly associated with the organization. And the sources of funding are obscure. The organization has published, I believe it's 5 reports to date, and this is over a period of 10 years. And of those 5 reports, only one really focuses directly on Dalit issues. The others focus mainly on Islamophobia, which is a bit odd for a Dalit rights organization. Now, despite the fact that she describes it as specifically a feminist Dalit rights organization, there's very little emphasis on the status of women, and there's no emphasis at all or no mention at all of the status of women in Islam. Now, you mentioned, despite the charges of Islamophobia. Now, you mentioned earlier that I'd said in the report that there was a Dalit Muslim Sikh coalition. That's not exactly correct. There's a coalition between Dalit organizations, Muslim organizations, and Sikh organizations. Now, these organizations may not, and I suspect do not, represent the majority opinion of Dalits, Muslims, and Sikhs. We have no way to know whether they're actually representative of the groups they purport to represent to the public. So these 3 sets of organizations have been allied in attempting to stigmatize Hindus in the United States on the basis of allegations of caste-based discrimination. And we've seen that Tanmosi Sundararajan's organization, Equality Labs, seems to be overly concerned, considering it's a feminist Dalit organization, with Islamophobia in the United States and also Islamophobia in India. They've published an entire report on hate speech on Facebook in India, mainly hate speech directed against Muslims in their depiction. So they seem to be overly concerned. And then when we look at their actual activism in the United States on caste, at every point where Equality Labs is associated with a initiative to ban some form of caste-based discrimination, at almost every point, we see the Indian American Muslim Council as one of their co-sponsors. Now, I can't say that there's a funding connection between these organizations. I'm not a forensic accountant. I haven't delved into the financial records. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that Equality Labs is merely a front organization, not truly representing Dalit Americans, instead representing Tanmosi Sundararajan, who herself may have connections with Islamist organizations like the Indian American Muslim Council and with Khalistani organizations. That is, some Sikh organizations have supported her efforts. Again, not the Sikh religious community broadly, particular Sikh organizations that also tend to support the Khalistani cause.
So now there are a couple of things. One, you have also suggested that the survey which was conducted by Equality Labs was mostly online survey. So we may not be sure about the authenticity of the respondents,
Right.
also the way it is conducted. But that becomes the basis for the California,
Yeah.
for Senator Aisha Wahab and first Sikh uh, political representative Jasmeet Bains, and they talk about discrimination on the basis of caste using the data which is provided by Equality Lab, whose authenticity is being questioned directly,
Well,
indirectly in your paper.
it's not just being questioned. It's the authenticity is meaningless.
Uh,
Look, the survey was a uh, online survey that was spread via activist networks, with the result that it represents the opinions of anti-caste activists, not the opinions of the broad Dalit community. I'll just give you some basic statistics. Half of their respondents were under the age of 30. 96% were under the age of 50. So this is not the profile of larger proportion of larger population. They had a very large LGBTQIA plus component. Um, there's just an enormous concentration among activist, likely graduate students. 80% of their respondents either had a postgraduate education or are pursuing a postgraduate education. The modal respondent to the Equality Lab survey was a young, gender diverse postgraduate student activist. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a young, gender diverse postgraduate student activist, but that is not the general demographic of the broader Indian American or Dalit American community. It is a highly self-selected, highly motivated group who decided they wanted to be part of this survey. Now, looking beyond that, the survey itself seems to have been done in a very sloppy manner. So, for example, at one point they report that 26% of Dalits face violence, actual violence, physical violence, on account of their Dalit status in the United States. Now, if that seems unrealistically high, they also reported a different point in the survey that 25% of Dalits face either physical violence or verbal abuse. Well, look, anybody who knows a little bit of math can tell that it's impossible that 26% face physical violence, but only 25% face physical violence or verbal abuse. These statistics are completely inconsistent with each other. Another example, that 2/3 of their respondents say that they face discrimination on the basis of caste in the United States. Now, only about 1.5% of Americans are Hindu. Is it possible that 2/3 of these Dalits even have bosses who are Hindu? I mean, I understand that the Indian community is a relatively concentrated community. People know each other, but the idea that 2/3 of American Dalits could possibly have Hindu bosses, it is inconceivable in an environment where only 1.5% of the U.S. population is Hindu. So this is simply not a representative sample
so
of the
why
U.S.
why don't these politicians talk to you before coming up with these kind of bills as they did?
Look,
Uh,
the survey was conducted for political purposes. It was not conducted. I mean, if they wanted to broadly represent Dalits, they would have gone to temples, they would have gone to mainstream Hindu organizations and asked, could you spread this survey? We want to reach the entire population. Instead, they spread the survey among a small group of activist organizations, asking them to post the survey in their activist networks. Well, that's not going to get you any kind of representative sample.
okay, so let me quote you from your paper, and you have said the real goal of the proposed laws seems to be to turn an ill-informed American public against Hindus and Hindu religious institutions. I'm wondering if you try to think what could be the reason behind this.
So first, let's establish that fact. When California SB 403 was proposed last February, it was proposed by California's first Muslim state senator. It was co-sponsored by California's first Sikh state assemblywoman. This is Aisha Wahab and Jasmeet Bains. Okay. Their top legislative priority This, it's almost like a joke. A Muslim and a Sikh walk into a bar. What is their, what's the first thing they do? They want to bash Hindus. It's really bizarre that their top legislative priority should be to pass this bill to ban caste-based discrimination. Now, on top of that, although as far as I know, all Democratic state representatives in California either voted against it or abstained. Most Republicans voted for it or abstained. Not a single other Democrat joined them as co-sponsors. Now, ordinarily, a piece of civil rights legislation, ordinarily every Democrat and many Republicans would want to be associated with civil rights legislation. If it were a bill to ban discrimination based on race in America, probably the entire Democratic contingency of the California State Assembly would have joined as co-sponsors. This bill got no additional co-sponsors. So it's clear that other representatives in California, smelled a rat here. Now, on top of that, the bill said right in the bill, this is purely declaratory. It will have no effect on existing law. And in fact, when Governor Gavin Newsom eventually vetoed it, he vetoed it on the basis that it doesn't change existing law, which is to say that discrimination based on caste is already illegal in California. Okay, so why do they need a law to declare it illegal? Well, they needed that law to declare it illegal, not for the law itself, which would do nothing to change California law. They needed it for the preamble, because the preamble said effectively, whereas caste is a serious problem in South Asia, whereas Equality Labs find serious discrimination against Dalits, so it was for the series of findings embedded in the bill that the bill was proposed, right? There was no actual rationality to the bill in terms of its effect. The rationality was all in terms of its politics. And that's clear not just for the California bill. If it were only the California bill, I might have been more circumspect in my conclusions. It was also true of the Seattle ordinance that banned caste-based discrimination in Seattle. Again, purely declaratory. Existing law already banned caste-based discrimination. It's true of the of the non-discrimination policies at universities, which have been passed by the same coalition of militant Sikh groups, Islamist groups like the Indian American Muslim Council, and Equality Labs. The same coalition going to universities saying, ban caste-based discrimination on campus. It's entirely a manufactured problem that is a need to have these policies and bills, because caste-based discrimination is already illegal in all of these environments. They simply want to create the impression that Hindus are engaging in caste-based discrimination.
So, Professor Salvatore Babones, while I thank you very much joining me from University of Sydney, last question I have involves two sides. One, it seems there is Hindu phobia, which is not being recognized or acknowledged by Hindus at large. So, the first question is, why Hindu phobia? Very briefly. Second, what do you expect the Hindu community in particular to be proactively doing at this point of time? Because this is likely to have large long-term ramifications.
I know that the Hindu activist community is committed to this term Hindu phobia, but I think the reason it hasn't caught on is that it's not an accurate term. There is no large-scale Hindu phobia in the United States. Hindu phobia meaning fear of Hindus. And if you use the parallel, there is Islamophobia. People are afraid of Muslims. They're afraid that Muslims may be terrorists. They're afraid that Muslims may have strange religious customs. And that fear can be addressed by having programs to, meet other people and realize that everybody's human, and education efforts can combat phobias. What we see in America is not Hindu phobia. It is anti-Hinduism. It is an organized program of persecution of Hindus by a small group of, again, Dalit, Sikh, and Islamist organizations that are actively attempting to vilify the Hindu faith. Now, that anti-Hinduism is not widespread. So most Americans would not experience anti-Hinduism, most American Hindus, because in their daily lives, how often are they going to run into a Khalistani? How often are they going to run into an Islamic fundamentalist? Not very often. But at the level of policy formation, it's very effective because it creates an environment in which legislators and the press just simply accept that these allegations that Hindus engage in unsavory practices, they simply accept that these allegations are true because they're not getting a counter narrative. So I think the real reason we don't see people upset about Hindu phobia is that the reality is it's anti-Hinduism. And I think the model people have to have in their minds is that it's equivalent to anti-Semitism. It's on the same pattern as anti-Semitism. It's actually being conducted by the same organizations that often promote anti-Semitism are themselves promoting anti-Hinduism. Just to give you some examples, the same organizations that are promoting anti-Hinduism are also promoting free Kashmir. They're also promoting free Khalistan, and they're promoting free Palestine. Right? There's a convergence among these organizations that people don't seem to realize unless you start reading their materials in detail, one report after another, then you start to see the connections.
So this is a mysterious, if I say, or some sort of a structure that is playing out, which needs to be paid attention to, and the way you have seen from the macro angle as well as from the micro angle will definitely help people in figuring out, one, what it is, two, what needs to be done, and three, how to be aware of the way things are playing out. So as a professor, what you are doing is remarkable, and I appreciate, and my good wishes for you to continue to work with the kind of focus and the sense of purpose that you have. So once again, thanking Professor Babones for joining us, and enlightening us on the paper, which is very, very important and relevant for our times. That is the weaponization of caste in America, and I'm sure it won't go much far to cause the uh, kind of intended damage that seems to be at the seed of this weaponization process. So, once again, thanking you and thanking all of you, our viewers. This is Ashok Vyas.